In the shadowed chambers of the Palazzo Vecchio, where Niccolò Machiavelli once walked and contemplated the nature of power, a fundamental truth emerged that would echo through centuries: the man who masters his emotions masters his fate. This principle, carved from the marble of human experience and polished by the blood of fallen princes, stands as the cornerstone of what we might call the Machiavellian mindset, a philosophy that recognizes emotional detachment not as coldness, but as the highest form of strategic intelligence. The modern battlefield may have shifted from the city-states of Renaissance Italy to the corporate boardrooms, political arenas, and social hierarchies of our contemporary world, yet the fundamental dynamics remain unchanged. Power flows to those who can think clearly when others are clouded by passion, who can act decisively when others are paralyzed by fear, and who can maintain their course when others are swayed by the emotional currents of the moment. Consider the paradox that governs human nature: we are emotional creatures living in a world that rewards rational calculation. The man who allows his feelings to dictate his actions becomes a puppet dancing to the tune of circumstances beyond his control. He reacts rather than responds, follows rather than leads, and ultimately finds himself at the mercy of those who have learned to harness the very emotions that enslave him. The concept of detachment, however, is frequently misunderstood. It is not the absence of emotion, for even Machiavelli understood that passion could be a tool when properly channeled. Rather, it is the mastery of emotion, the ability to feel without being controlled by those feelings, to understand the emotional landscape without being swept away by its currents. This distinction separates the truly powerful from those who merely appear to hold power but are, in reality, slaves to their own psychological weaknesses. In the court of Lorenzo de' Medici, observers noted how the most influential advisors were not those who spoke with the greatest passion, but those who could maintain their composure even as others raged or wept. They possessed what the ancients called ataraxia, an unshakable tranquility that allowed them to see clearly when others were blinded by their emotional storms. This quality, more than intelligence or charisma, determined who would rise and who would fall in the deadly game of Renaissance politics. The biological reality of our emotional responses reveals why detachment provides such a decisive advantage. When faced with threat, rejection, or uncertainty, the human brain defaults to ancient patterns of fight, flight, or freeze. These responses, while useful for our prehistoric ancestors facing physical dangers, become liabilities in the complex social and professional environments of modern life. The man who can override these primitive impulses, who can think strategically even while his body prepares for battle, gains access to options and opportunities that remain invisible to his emotionally reactive competitors. This principle extends far beyond individual encounters to shape entire destinies. The emotionally reactive man lives at the mercy of external circumstances. A criticism from a superior sends him into defensive rage. A setback in his career plunges him into despair. A challenge to his authority triggers a desperate scramble to reassert dominance. Each reaction weakens his position, reveals his vulnerabilities, and provides his opponents with the very weapons they need to defeat him. Contrast this with the man who has cultivated emotional sovereignty. Criticism becomes information to be analyzed and potentially incorporated into his strategy. Setbacks become opportunities to reassess and adapt his approach. Challenges become chances to demonstrate his competence through action rather than emotion. He moves through the world like a skilled chess player, thinking several moves ahead while his opponents struggle to respond to the immediate threats in front of them. The cultivation of this detachment begins with a fundamental shift in perspective, from seeing oneself as the center of the universe to recognizing oneself as a player in a larger game. This shift does not diminish one's importance or ambition, rather, it clarifies the nature of the battlefield and the rules by which victory is achieved. The man who takes every slight personally, who sees every setback as a reflection of his worth, who measures his value by the opinions of others, has already ceded control of his destiny to forces beyond his influence. The Stoic philosophers, whose wisdom heavily influenced Machiavellian thought, understood this principle deeply. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journal that would become the Meditations, repeatedly reminded himself that external events have only the power over him that he chooses to give them. This was not the philosophy of a passive man, but of an emperor who ruled the known world while maintaining his inner equilibrium. His detachment from outcomes he could not control allowed him to focus his energy entirely on the actions he could take and the decisions he could make. This same principle applies to the modern practitioner of the Machiavellian mindset. In business negotiations, the man who can walk away from any deal holds the strongest position. His lack of desperate attachment to a particular outcome allows him to negotiate from a position of strength, to make demands that would be impossible for someone who needs the deal to succeed. His detachment becomes his greatest asset, more valuable than any technical skill or market knowledge he might possess. In relationships, whether romantic, professional, or social, the dynamics remain constant. The person who needs approval, who craves validation, who cannot bear the thought of rejection, broadcasts their weakness to everyone around them. They become easy to manipulate, simple to control, and ultimately disposable when their usefulness ends. The man who maintains his emotional independence, who values himself regardless of others' opinions, who can accept rejection without losing his sense of worth, commands respect and attracts loyalty precisely because he does not demand it. This transformation requires more than intellectual understanding, it demands a fundamental rewiring of one's psychological responses. The process begins with observation, learning to recognize the early warning signs of emotional reactivity before they overwhelm rational thought. The tightening of the jaw, the quickening of the pulse, the narrowing of vision that accompanies emotional arousal, these physical signals provide opportunities to pause, breathe, and choose a response rather than simply react. The practice of delay becomes crucial in this development. Where the reactive man responds immediately to provocation, the detached man creates space between stimulus and response. This gap, measured in seconds or minutes rather than hours, provides the opportunity for strategic thinking to override emotional impulse. In this space, the truly powerful man asks not "how does this make me feel," but "how can I use this to advance my position?" The social dynamics of power reveal why emotional detachment provides such a decisive advantage. Human beings are instinctively drawn to strength and repelled by weakness. The man who can remain calm under pressure, who can think clearly in crisis, who can maintain his composure when others lose theirs, naturally becomes the person others turn to for leadership and guidance. His detachment does not make him cold or inhuman, rather, it makes him reliable, trustworthy, and effective, qualities that are increasingly rare in our emotionally volatile world. The accumulation of power follows naturally from this positioning. As others recognize his stability and competence, they begin to defer to his judgment. As they witness his ability to navigate complex situations without becoming overwhelmed, they seek his counsel. As they observe his success in achieving his objectives while others struggle with emotional chaos, they want to align themselves with his strength. The detached man does not need to seek power, power seeks him. Yet this path is not without its challenges. The society around us often rewards emotional display over emotional control. We are encouraged to express our feelings, to share our vulnerabilities, to seek validation through emotional connection. While these behaviors may provide temporary relief or social acceptance, they ultimately weaken our position in the broader game of life. The man who chooses the path of detachment must be prepared to be misunderstood, to be labeled as cold or calculating, to be criticized for his refusal to engage in the emotional theater that consumes so much human energy. This criticism itself becomes a test of his commitment to the path. The truly detached man neither defends himself against these accusations nor attacks those who make them. He simply continues on his chosen course, allowing his results to speak for themselves. His success becomes his vindication, his effectiveness his defense, his power his ultimate answer to those who question his methods. The financial markets provide perhaps the clearest illustration of these principles in action. The emotional trader, driven by fear and greed, makes decisions based on how market movements make him feel rather than what they mean for his long-term objectives. He buys at peaks because the rising prices excite him and sells at bottoms because falling prices terrify him. His emotions, rather than his analysis, determine his actions, and his portfolio reflects this lack of discipline. The detached trader operates from an entirely different paradigm. Market volatility becomes information rather than emotional stimulus. Losses become data points in a larger strategy rather than personal failures. Gains become confirmation of sound analysis rather than validation of his worth. This emotional distance allows him to cut losses quickly, hold winners patiently, and make decisions based on probability rather than psychology. Over time, this disciplined approach compounds into significant outperformance, demonstrating the material value of emotional sovereignty. The same dynamics apply to career advancement, relationship management, and personal development. The man who can separate his ego from his strategy, his feelings from his actions, his immediate desires from his long-term objectives, gains access to a level of effectiveness that remains perpetually out of reach for his emotionally reactive competitors. As we progress deeper into this exploration of the Machiavellian mindset, we begin to see that emotional detachment is not merely a useful skill but a fundamental requirement for any man who aspires to true power and lasting success. It forms the foundation upon which all other strategic capabilities are built, the bedrock from which genuine strength emerges, and the starting point for the transformation from one who is acted upon to one who acts. Part 2: The Forging of Inner Invincibility. The process of destroying one's weak self is neither quick nor comfortable. It requires a man to confront the very foundations of his identity, to examine the stories he tells himself about who he is and why he behaves as he does, and to systematically dismantle the psychological structures that keep him trapped in patterns of weakness and reactivity. This destruction is not random violence against the psyche, but surgical precision in removing the cancerous elements that prevent genuine strength from emerging. The weak self manifests in countless ways, but its core characteristics remain consistent across all men who remain trapped within its confines. It is the voice that whispers of inadequacy when faced with challenge, that screams of injustice when others succeed, that pleads for validation from those whose opinions should hold no weight over our actions. It is the part of us that needs to be liked rather than respected, understood rather than feared, included rather than independent. Most dangerously, it is the aspect of our personality that mistakes emotional reaction for authentic response, that confuses feeling deeply with thinking clearly. In the laboratories of human behavior that are our modern institutions, corporations, universities, political organizations, social movements, we can observe the weak self in action daily. Watch the middle manager who becomes defensive when his decisions are questioned, revealing his deep insecurity about his competence. Observe the academic who attacks the character of those who challenge his theories, demonstrating his inability to separate his ideas from his identity. Notice the politician who responds to criticism with emotional appeals rather than logical arguments, showing his dependence on popular approval for his sense of self-worth. Each of these examples illustrates the fundamental vulnerability of the weak self. It requires external validation to maintain its sense of reality. The man trapped within this psychological framework is like a building constructed on shifting sand, impressive perhaps in appearance, but fundamentally unstable and doomed to collapse when the ground beneath it moves. His confidence depends on the approval of others, his decisions are distorted by his need to maintain his image, and his effectiveness is limited by his fear of failure or rejection. The strong self, by contrast, exists independent of external circumstances. It draws its strength not from what others think or say, but from an internal foundation of competence, purpose, and unshakable conviction. This is not arrogance or blind self-confidence, but rather a deeply grounded understanding of one's capabilities and limitations, coupled with an unwavering commitment to act according to one's own judgment regardless of external pressure. The transformation from weak self to strong self begins with what the ancient Greeks called the examined life, a ruthless and ongoing analysis of one's own motivations, fears, and behavioral patterns. This examination must be conducted with the detachment of a scientist studying an interesting specimen, without the emotional investment that would cloud objective observation. The man undertaking this work must be prepared to discover aspects of himself that he may find uncomfortable or embarrassing, to acknowledge patterns of weakness that he has previously rationalized or ignored. Consider the common pattern of seeking approval through achievement. The weak self drives a man to excel not for the intrinsic satisfaction of excellence, but for the external recognition that achievement brings. He works long hours not because he loves his craft, but because he needs others to see him as dedicated. He pursues prestigious positions not because they align with his values, but because they enhance his image in the eyes of others. This motivation, while it may produce impressive results in the short term, creates a fundamental instability in his foundation. His success depends not only on his performance but on the ongoing approval of those whose opinions he has elevated above his own judgment. The process of destroying this weak self requires a deliberate withdrawal of energy from the need for external validation. This withdrawal is not a single dramatic gesture but a gradual shift in focus from external metrics to internal standards. The man begins to measure his worth by his adherence to his own principles rather than by others' approval of his actions. He starts to derive satisfaction from the quality of his work rather than the recognition it receives. He learns to trust his own judgment even when it conflicts with popular opinion or conventional wisdom. This transformation is particularly challenging in our current cultural moment, which seems to reward emotional expression and vulnerability while punishing the kind of stoic strength that characterized earlier generations of successful men. Social media platforms amplify emotional reactions, business cultures emphasize collaboration and consensus, and popular psychology promotes the sharing of feelings as the path to authentic connection. The man choosing to develop emotional sovereignty must navigate this environment while maintaining his commitment to a fundamentally different approach. The weak self is particularly vulnerable to what might be called emotional contagion, the tendency to absorb and mirror the emotional states of others. In meetings, the weak man becomes anxious when others appear stressed, defensive when others become aggressive, excited when others show enthusiasm. His emotional state becomes a reflection of his environment rather than a product of his own internal compass. This reactivity makes him predictable and, therefore, controllable. Others quickly learn which emotional buttons to push to elicit the responses they want from him. The strong self, by contrast, maintains its emotional equilibrium regardless of the emotional weather around it. This does not mean becoming unresponsive or insensitive to others' emotions, but rather developing the ability to observe and understand emotional dynamics without being controlled by them. The man who has achieved this level of emotional sovereignty can acknowledge that others are angry without becoming angry himself, can recognize that others are afraid without allowing their fear to influence his decision-making, can observe that others are excited without letting their enthusiasm override his rational analysis. This emotional independence becomes a source of tremendous power in human interactions. When others are swept up in the emotional current of the moment, whether it be fear, anger, excitement, or despair, the man who remains calm and centered naturally becomes the anchor point around which others organize their responses. His stability draws people to him, his clarity cuts through confusion, and his composure provides a model that others unconsciously seek to emulate. The destruction of the weak self also requires a fundamental shift in how one relates to failure and setback. The weak self interprets failure as evidence of personal inadequacy, setback as confirmation of unworthiness, criticism as attack on fundamental identity. These interpretations create emotional chaos that clouds judgment and impairs decision-making precisely when clarity is most needed. The man trapped in this mindset becomes increasingly risk-averse, increasingly dependent on sure things and safe choices, increasingly unable to pursue the kind of bold action that creates significant success. The strong self views these same experiences through an entirely different lens. Failure becomes information about what doesn't work, setback becomes an opportunity to refine strategy, criticism becomes data about how one's actions are perceived and, potentially, how they might be modified for greater effectiveness. This shift in interpretation eliminates the emotional charge from negative experiences, allowing the man to learn from them rather than be traumatized by them. The practical implications of this transformation extend into every area of life. In business negotiations, the man who has destroyed his weak self can walk away from disadvantageous deals because his self-worth is not tied to closing every opportunity. In romantic relationships, he can maintain his own interests and boundaries because he does not need his partner's approval to feel valuable. In social situations, he can speak his mind honestly because he is not dependent on others' agreement to maintain his sense of identity. This independence creates what military strategists call freedom of action, the ability to choose from the full range of possible responses rather than being constrained by emotional or psychological limitations. The weak man's options are always restricted by his need to protect his image, maintain others' approval, or avoid psychological discomfort. The strong man's options are limited only by practical considerations and strategic calculations. The cultivation of physical discipline plays a crucial role in this transformation. The weak self seeks comfort, avoids discomfort, and follows the path of least resistance. The strong self embraces challenge, seeks difficulty, and grows stronger through voluntary exposure to stress. Regular physical training, whether through martial arts, weightlifting, endurance sports, or other demanding activities, serves as both metaphor and practical exercise in choosing discomfort in service of strength. The gym becomes a laboratory for testing one's commitment to the destruction of the weak self. When the weight is heavy and the mind says quit, when the muscles are fatigued and the body wants to rest, when the voice of comfort and ease grows loud, these moments provide opportunities to practice choosing the difficult path. Each time a man pushes through physical discomfort to complete his training, he strengthens not only his body but his psychological capacity to override his immediate impulses in service of his larger objectives. Similarly, the practice of voluntary discomfort in other areas of life, cold showers, fasting, meditation in challenging conditions, deliberate exposure to social rejection, serves to desensitize the nervous system to the kinds of stress that typically trigger emotional reactivity. The man who regularly exposes himself to controlled doses of discomfort becomes increasingly difficult to disturb through external pressure. The intellectual dimension of this transformation requires a similar commitment to rigorous honesty and self-examination. The weak self constructs elaborate rationalizations for its limitations, creates complex justifications for its failures, and builds sophisticated defenses against uncomfortable truths. The destruction of this weak self requires a willingness to see clearly, even when the view is unflattering. This intellectual honesty extends to one's assessment of others as well. The weak self tends to either idealize or demonize those around it, particularly those in positions of power or influence. The strong self sees others as they are complex individuals with their own strengths and limitations, their own motivations and blind spots, their own capacity for both good and evil. This clarity of perception provides significant advantages in navigating social and professional relationships. The development of what might be called strategic patience becomes crucial in this process. The weak self wants immediate gratification, instant recognition, rapid advancement. It becomes frustrated when progress is slow, angry when others advance more quickly, despondent when setbacks occur. The strong self understands that meaningful achievement requires time, that lasting success is built through consistent action over extended periods, and that temporary setbacks are simply part of the larger pattern of growth and development. This patience is not passive waiting but active preparation. While others are consumed with the emotional drama of immediate circumstances, the man who has destroyed his weak self is quietly building the skills, relationships, and resources that will position him for future opportunities. He invests in long-term growth rather than short-term validation, in sustainable development rather than quick fixes. The social dimensions of this transformation can be particularly challenging, as the destruction of the weak self often requires distancing oneself from relationships and environments that reinforce weakness. The man committed to this path may find himself increasingly isolated from friends who mistake emotional reactivity for authenticity, from family members who interpret his growing independence as rejection, from colleagues who feel threatened by his increasing competence and confidence. This isolation is not permanent, but it is often necessary. The weak self is maintained and reinforced by social environments that reward its patterns. The man seeking to transform himself must be willing to step away from these environments, even temporarily, to create space for new patterns to develop. As his transformation progresses, he will naturally attract new relationships with individuals who appreciate strength rather than weakness, who value competence over compliance, who respect independence rather than dependence. The emergence of the strong self is not a destination but an ongoing process. Each day presents new opportunities to choose strength over weakness, independence over dependence, strategic thinking over emotional reaction. The man committed to this path must maintain constant vigilance against the tendency to slip back into old patterns, particularly during times of stress or uncertainty when the weak self's familiar patterns may seem easier or more comfortable. Yet the rewards of this transformation extend far beyond personal satisfaction. As the man destroys his weak self and cultivates his strong self, he becomes increasingly valuable to others, not because he seeks their approval, but because he has something genuine to offer. His stability becomes an asset in unstable times, his clarity becomes valuable in confusing situations, his strength becomes attractive to those who recognize its worth. The irony of the path toward inner invincibility is that the less a man needs from others, the more others are drawn to him. The destruction of the weak self creates not isolation but connection on a higher level, relationships based on mutual respect and shared strength rather than mutual weakness and shared need. Part 3, The Mastery of Unshakable Dominance. The final transformation in this journey toward Machiavellian mastery represents the synthesis of emotional detachment and inner invincibility into something approaching unshakable dominance. This is not the crude dominance of the tyrant who rules through fear and force, nor the fragile dominance of the insecure leader who demands constant validation of his authority. Instead, it is the subtle, pervasive dominance of the man who has become so fundamentally strong that his very presence alters the dynamics of any situation he enters. This form of dominance operates through what might be called gravitational pull. Just as massive objects in space bend the fabric of reality around them, the man who has achieved true psychological mastery bends the social and professional environment around his own centered strength. Others unconsciously orient themselves toward his stability, seek his approval more than he seeks theirs, and find themselves naturally deferring to his judgment even when they had no intention of doing so. The mechanism by which this dominance operates is both subtle and profound. In any human interaction, there exists an invisible hierarchy of psychological strength. People instinctively recognize who is operating from a position of genuine confidence and who is performing confidence to mask underlying insecurity. They can sense who is driven by internal motivation and who is dependent on external validation. They respond to these perceptions at a level below conscious awareness, automatically assuming more or less dominant or submissive postures based on their unconscious assessment of relative strength. The man who has completed the transformation described in the previous sections broadcasts strength through every aspect of his presence. His posture reflects his inner confidence without being artificially aggressive. His speech patterns demonstrate his comfort with his own thoughts and opinions without requiring constant validation. His eye contact reflects his willingness to see and be seen without the nervous avoidance or desperate seeking that characterizes weaker men. Most importantly, his entire demeanor communicates that he is fundamentally unaffected by the approval or disapproval of those around him. This psychological independence creates what military strategists recognize as the ultimate position of strength, the ability to dictate the terms of engagement. Just as the army that can choose when and where to fight holds an enormous advantage over the army that must react to its enemy's movements, the man who operates from this position of psychological dominance can structure interactions to his advantage rather than being forced to respond to others' initiatives. Consider the dynamics of a business meeting where such a man is present. While others may arrive early to network, check their phones nervously, or engage in small talk to ease their anxiety, he arrives precisely on time and settles into his space with calm confidence. While others speak quickly or hesitantly, seeking signs of approval or agreement, he speaks deliberately and allows silence to follow his words rather than rushing to fill it. While others interrupt or compete for attention, he waits for natural openings and speaks with such authority that the room naturally quiets to hear his words. These behaviors are not techniques or tactics that can be simply learned and applied. They are the natural expressions of inner transformation. The man who has destroyed his weak self and forged genuine inner strength does not need to perform dominance because he has become dominance. His confidence is not an act because he has eliminated the insecurities that would make such acting necessary. His authority is not claimed because it is simply recognized by others as a natural fact. The compound effect of this transformation creates what might be called effortless influence. Where other men must work constantly to maintain their position, to defend their authority, to prove their worth, the man who has achieved this level of mastery finds that influence flows naturally from his presence. Others seek his opinion because they trust his judgment. They accept his decisions because they recognize his competence. They follow his leadership because they are drawn to his strength rather than compelled by his force. This effortless influence extends across all domains of human interaction. In professional settings, he naturally rises to positions of greater responsibility not through political maneuvering or self-promotion, but because others recognize his capability and want to align themselves with his success. In social situations, conversations naturally center around his interests and perspectives not because he demands attention, but because others find his thoughts more interesting than their own internal chatter. The relationship dynamics reveal perhaps the clearest illustration of this principle. The man who has achieved this level of mastery attracts higher quality relationships across all categories, professional, social, and romantic, because he offers genuine value rather than neediness. His emotional independence makes him attractive to strong people while simultaneously repelling those who are primarily interested in drama, validation, or codependent connections. In romantic relationships specifically, this dynamic creates what might be called the paradox of attraction. The less a man needs a particular woman's approval or affection, the more attractive he becomes to women who are worth having. His willingness to walk away from relationships that do not serve his highest interests makes him more valuable to those who want to create relationships that do serve both parties' interests. His refusal to compromise his standards or change himself to accommodate others' preferences creates a natural selection process that filters for partners who appreciate him as he is rather than as they might want him to become. The economic implications of this transformation extend far beyond simple career advancement. The man who operates from this position of strength naturally attracts better opportunities because opportunities flow toward competence and confidence. He negotiates more favorable terms because he can walk away from disadvantageous arrangements. He builds more valuable networks because valuable people want to associate with other valuable people. Over time, these advantages compound into significant material success that appears effortless to outside observers but is actually the natural result of psychological mastery. The financial markets again provide clear examples of these principles in operation. The trader or investor who has achieved genuine emotional detachment can hold positions through volatility that would shake out weaker hands. He can buy when others are selling in panic and sell when others are buying in euphoria. His decisions are based on analysis rather than emotion, on long-term strategy rather than short-term impulse. These advantages compound over time into superior returns that appear almost magical to those who remain trapped in emotional reactivity. The political dimensions of this transformation reveal themselves in both formal political contexts and the informal politics of any organization or social group. The man who has achieved this level of mastery naturally becomes a center of influence not because he seeks power but because power seeks him. Others want him on their team, want his endorsement of their initiatives, want to align themselves with his strength and competence. He can afford to be selective about which battles he fights because he has alternatives, and this selectivity makes his eventual commitments more valuable to those who receive them. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of this transformation lies in its self-reinforcing nature. The man who achieves this level of mastery finds that success becomes increasingly inevitable because he has eliminated the internal obstacles that previously prevented him from recognizing and capitalizing on opportunities. His clarity of vision allows him to see possibilities that remain invisible to those clouded by emotional reactivity. His emotional stability allows him to take calculated risks that would paralyze more fearful men. His independence from others' opinions allows him to pursue unconventional strategies that prove more effective than conventional approaches. This inevitability of success is not guaranteed in any particular venture. The man who has achieved mastery still faces external obstacles, market forces, and simple bad luck. However, his psychological foundation ensures that temporary setbacks become learning experiences rather than devastating failures, that closed doors redirect him toward better opportunities rather than convincing him of his inadequacy, and that criticism provides useful feedback rather than emotional devastation. The cultivation of what might be called strategic vision becomes both the cause and effect of this transformation. The man operating from genuine strength can afford to think in longer time horizons because he is not driven by immediate emotional needs. He can see patterns that others miss because his perception is not distorted by wishful thinking or fearful anticipation. He can make decisions based on strategic considerations rather than tactical reactions because he has the emotional stability to execute long-term plans even when they require short-term sacrifice. This strategic vision extends to his understanding of other people and their motivations. The man who has achieved mastery can read human nature clearly because he has studied his own nature thoroughly. He can predict how others will respond to different situations because he understands the emotional patterns that drive most human behavior. This understanding allows him to structure interactions and environments to produce the outcomes he desires without resorting to manipulation or coercion. The ethical dimensions of this mastery deserve particular attention, as the power that comes from this transformation can be used for constructive or destructive purposes. The man who has achieved genuine strength has the option to use his influence to benefit others or simply himself, to build or to destroy, to inspire others toward their own strength or to exploit their weaknesses. The choice of how to use this power ultimately reveals the character of the man who wields it. The highest expression of this mastery involves what might be called constructive dominance, the use of one's strength and influence to create value for others while advancing one's own interests. This approach recognizes that sustainable dominance must be based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation, that true power grows through empowering others rather than diminishing them, and that lasting influence comes from being valuable to others rather than threatening to them. The man who embodies this approach becomes not just successful but significant. His influence extends beyond his immediate sphere to shape the culture and environment around him. He becomes a model that others seek to emulate, a standard against which others measure themselves, a source of inspiration for those who recognize the possibility of their own transformation. The maintenance of this level of mastery requires ongoing vigilance and continuous refinement. The external environment constantly presents new challenges and temptations to revert to earlier patterns of weakness. Success itself can become a trap if it leads to complacency or arrogance. The man committed to maintaining his mastery must continue to challenge himself, to seek new sources of growth and difficulty, to resist the natural tendency toward comfort and ease that success can provide. Yet the rewards of this mastery extend far beyond material success or social position. The man who has achieved this transformation experiences a fundamental peace that comes from knowing he is operating at his highest potential. He has eliminated the internal conflicts that plague weaker men, resolved the contradictions that create psychological chaos, and achieved the integration of thought, feeling, and action that represents genuine maturity. This integration creates what might be called authentic presence, a way of being in the world that is completely aligned with his deepest values and highest aspirations. He no longer needs to perform different versions of himself for different audiences because he has become someone who is worth being in all circumstances. His public self and private self are unified because he has eliminated the shameful secrets and hidden weaknesses that typically require such division. The ripple effects of this transformation extend far beyond the individual who achieves it. The man who embodies this level of mastery becomes a stabilizing force in an increasingly chaotic world. His presence calms anxiety, his clarity cuts through confusion, his strength provides a foundation that others can build upon. He becomes valuable not just for what he can do but for who he has become, not just for his skills but for his character. In a world that increasingly rewards emotional reactivity, celebrates victim consciousness, and confuses feeling with thinking, the man who achieves this mastery represents an alternative path. He demonstrates that strength is still possible, that independence is still achievable, that mastery remains within reach for those willing to pay the price required to obtain it. The journey from emotional reactivity to unshakable dominance is neither quick nor easy, but it remains one of the most worthwhile endeavors a man can undertake. It requires the destruction of comfortable illusions, the abandonment of easy excuses, and the acceptance of complete responsibility for one's thoughts, feelings, and actions. Yet for those who complete this transformation, the rewards are beyond calculation, not just success, but mastery, not just achievement, but fulfillment, not just power, but the wisdom to use power well. The man who destroys his weak self cannot be destroyed by others because he has eliminated the vulnerabilities that others could exploit. He has become anti-fragile, growing stronger under stress rather than breaking under pressure. He has achieved what the ancient Stoics called the invulnerable life, not because nothing can touch him, but because nothing external can fundamentally alter his inner foundation of strength. This is the ultimate advantage of detachment, the final fruit of the Machiavellian mindset properly understood. It is not coldness but clarity, not indifference but independence, not isolation but inner integration. The man who achieves this mastery becomes not less human but more fully human, not disconnected from others but connected from a position of strength rather than neediness. The game of life continues around him, with its endless dramas and eternal struggles for position and power. But he plays this game from a fundamentally different position than those who remain trapped in emotional reactivity and psychological weakness. He plays not from desperation but from abundance, not from fear but from confidence, not from need but from choice. And, in this playing, he naturally comes to control the game itself, not through force or manipulation, but through the simple fact that he has become the kind of man that others want to follow, to emulate, and to align themselves with. This is the path from weakness to strength, from reactivity to mastery, from being controlled by the game to controlling the game itself. It remains open to any man willing to pay the price in honest self-examination, disciplined practice, and unwavering commitment to becoming the strongest version of himself. The choice, as always, remains with the individual, but the rewards of this choice extend far beyond the individual to touch everyone whose life he impacts through his transformed presence and unshakable strength.